Mention the province of Ontario during an election, and you will invariably hear the term vote rich. And that perfectly describes this most populous province. The Trudeau Liberals need to win 15 more seats than they won in 2019 to win a majority. Many of those seats could come from Ontario.
Ontario is huge. It's a huge opportunity, and it tends to swing to the winning party. You know, we've seen it go from chunks of Conservative to Liberal. We've seen the NDP get in there in downtown. So it's an absolutely crucial area. It's a battleground, and it really shows the signs of which party is going to succeed in the federal election.
The issues that concern Ontario are similar to those right across the country.
Well, Ontario is an interesting beast. You can't always predict exactly what people are going to be talking about during the campaign. Campaigns change things. But the issues that are normally present in elections are issues about affordability, particularly in the Greater Toronto Area. Housing, we've already heard the federal Conservatives talk a lot about housing affordability. Climate change always plays a very big role. The economy, and I think certainly in this campaign, it's going to be a lot about the pandemic as well. How to get people back on their feet, how they think the federal government performed during the pandemic. And I think it will also be a referendum on the provincial government as well, because the provinces were responsible for so much during the pandemic, including vaccine distribution. So it's a bit of a mishmash. You don't always know if there's one issue that's going to percolate or permeate, or if it's going to be kind of about leadership qualities or a kind of a variety of issues that people are going to be talking about as the campaign gets going.
I do think that climate change is something that a lot of Ontario voters have demonstrated they will make their choice about, because it represents a little bit more of what's the future of this country? What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our planet? Are we giving our kids a better lives than the one that we had? And I think climate change is an issue that speaks to that a lot more directly. And I think that's, going back to where's the Prime Minister strong and where are the Conservatives weakest, I think that's another, one of those examples where we have an issue that's going to be top of mind for a lot of people when they show up at the polls, and a place where Liberals are pretty strong.
Indigenous issues will also figure prominently in this election.
The discovery of unmarked grave sites across the country have really shocked the population, and I do think that people are extremely saddened and disturbed by this. And I think, certainly in ridings with larger Indigenous populations, this is going to be a major issue. But I do think Canadians care about this. They want to talk about this issue, and they want to hear from the federal leaders how they're going to make this right with the Indigenous community.
Hanging over this entire election campaign, of course, is the pandemic, the government's handling of it, and the pace of vaccine rollout.
COVID-19 changed everything. Justin Trudeau in the last election and the Liberals were extremely vulnerable. They came into that election not doing very well in the polls. We obviously had a big scandals during the election impacting Justin Trudeau. I think that now, this is going to be a referendum on Justin Trudeau, his government's leadership during the pandemic.
We made the choice as a government from the very beginning that we would help those millions of Canadians. And getting that help to 99% of the Canadians who needed it quickly and rapidly, if it meant even accepting that 1 or 2% might make fraudulent claims, was the choice that we gladly made. We needed to get help to Canadians immediately, and that's what we did.
Certainly, I think Canadians are responding very positively to his performance during the pandemic. I've seen, a lot of voter groups across the country, here in Ontario as well, in some focus group sessions, talk about the fact that they still have their house because of what the Prime Minister's done during the pandemic. The policies such as the CERB that allowed so many Canadians to preserve their income and be able to pay the mortgage and put food on the table. I think that reality still factors very heavily into the minds of Canadians. The we'll do anything to make sure that you're kept whole mentality that the government communicated very effectively throughout the pandemic is being rewarded. So that's an enormous strength.
I need to know more about why we didn't have vaccines sooner, why, knowing for years that the pandemic was on the way, because people have known that, why did we leave our opportunity to make vaccines? Why did we subcontract that out to other countries? Why were we, because obviously every country is going to take care of their own people first. So why was that flank left unattended?
So much has happened over the past 18 months that he has no control of, none of us have any control of, and I certainly was a big fan of his in 2018-19, so I would be again, I think.
I think he did well with the pandemic. I think people bashed him because of delays in vaccines and stuff, but I think he did a good job.
I think we're just trying to get back to normal at this time, so I think that's the biggest thing, and I think everyone's pulled their weight province-wide, federally, nationally. I think everyone's been doing a great job, and I mean, under the conditions we currently are under, it's just they're doing the best job they can at this time, and I think they're really looking out for the people of Canada.
But former Conservative Cabinet Minister Lisa Raitt believes the jury is still out on Justin Trudeau's performance during the pandemic.
Well, we've got vaccines and we've got vaccinations and we've got people waiting to get outside again and have confidence. So I think he thinks he did a good job. I do believe, though, this is one of those things that you can't judge at this moment in time. I'm a big advocate for having a good look at how we responded to the pandemic, maybe in a year from now, and to really get an understanding of where did we fall down? Where could we have done better? I mean, they had some real baubles at the beginning. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask, lots of miscommunication. And that may have contributed to people not trusting vaccines today and not wanting to get that last 20% of Canadians vaccinated. So those are things to take a look at. So to your response directly, to your question directly, do I think he's done a good job? I don't know yet.
Former NDP Member of Parliament Peggy Nash thinks Jagmeet Singh did handle himself well during the pandemic crisis, and that could result in more votes for the New Democratic Party.
He is going to be reminding them that it was the NDP that boosted the CERB, that helped them get the 5 million Canadians that got CERB, that they got $2,000 instead of $1,000 because of the NDP. They put an ad out now where he's crediting the NDP for having improved the benefits that Canadians got. The CERB, the wage subsidy, the environmental legislation. So he's going to be reminding them that when you have NDP members elected to Parliament, they can deliver for people. So that's going to be their message.
But small businesses, for the most part, haven't been buying that message. Many feel they've been left behind during COVID-19.
Small business in Milton is very upset by the closures. The fact that they've been shut down for 400 days, that they're still having to serve on patios, that they couldn't get there. Small business really felt it. Although there were income supports there, there's a great frustration that they felt they should have been open earlier. I don't know how that plays in the federal election, because I know provincially they're unhappy with the provincial government. Federally, I don't know how that's going to play.
Despite all of the promises of we have your back at all levels of government, in Ontario alone we've lost tens of thousands of businesses to bankruptcy, and we will lose more unless two things happen. One, that the subsidy programs that are in place stay in place for as long as it takes for businesses to get back up to 100%, because it's not an on-off switch, it's a dimmer switch. And talk about eliminating those subsidies is not helpful. And number two, we as consumers need to do our part. This is not just about government, it's about us buying local. You know, no business goes into business thinking I'm going to live off the government. They get into business because they're proud of their product, their services, their people, and they want the cash register to ring. So we need to do our part to make sure that happens.
As in 2019, one factor that might influence this election again is Ontario Premier Doug Ford.
I think there's definitely a Ford factor. I mean, Doug Ford is an extremely polarizing figure, and we've seen that throughout the pandemic and the way that he's been perceived in the public polling. At the beginning, he was riding high, and then as things kind of started to go off the rails here in Ontario, reopening, closing, numbers rising, we really saw his personal popularity numbers take a dive. I think that he'll absolutely play a role in this election. The big question, though, is how much the other parties, the federal parties, make him part of the election. In the last election, Justin Trudeau was out there attacking Premier Ford as if he was his main opponent because he saw a weakness there. I don't know that he will take the exact same tactic this time because, the federal Liberals have had their own stumbles throughout the pandemic. I've also heard from senior Ford sources that Premier Ford is not going to kind of sit back on the sidelines like he did in the last election. If the Liberals take a swing at him, he's going to fight back because he does see a weakness there on things such as border controls. We've obviously seen the provincial Progressive Conservatives take out attack ads against the federal Liberals on this, vaccine procurement. So I don't think we're going to see Premier Ford out there campaigning with Erin O'Toole, but I do think we're going to see him swing back and try to protect his own reputation if he is attacked by the federal Liberals.
My biggest concern, Colin, is these variants that are coming in through the border. I've put in numerous requests. I've been out in public asking for them to tighten up the measures. We sent 4 letters. We know cases are coming in on a daily basis at the airport. And 15 the other day, 10 the other day, and they all add up. And then we have thousands of people bucking the system, not staying in hotel quarantine, and just walking across the border. So that's extremely concerning.
Doug Ford factored very heavily into the 2019 campaign. It was almost the most frequent expression from the Prime Minister was about the risks of Doug Ford and his Conservative Party. I'm not sure that it's going to be as much of a reality in the forthcoming campaign. I think the Prime Minister is probably going to be a bit more focused on a positive message about what his government will continue to do for Canadians if they're returned to office and given a majority mandate. Certainly the specter of Conservative politics will factor into the Liberal campaign. Whether or not Doug Ford will play the boogeyman or Erin O'Toole will play the boogeyman, I think remains to be seen.
Justin Trudeau is going to the polls less than 2 years into his mandate.
I think everybody knows that he can govern, he can get his legislation passed if he wants to. He can always find a partner in another party to support what he wants to do. That's been evident for the last couple of years. But I think most people know that he wants a majority government.
I don't think very often we talk about why an election was called a couple weeks into an election, frankly, right? I can't think of an election in recent memory where the rationale for having called the election factored into the campaign in any meaningful way. So I find it hard to believe there will be a significant pushback for the call. That said, of course, you can't just call out of the blue. I think the Prime Minister, though, does find himself in a position where, even with the minority that's not very long in the tooth, he has had a rather transformative incident over the course of the last year with the pandemic that has really altered the landscape of Canadian politics in many ways. And I think that probably, even on its own, is enough of a reason for him to go into the election with an excuse for taking Canadians to the polls.
Is it common for a minority government to seek a majority so early in its mandate? How often are they successful?
Yeah, that's not unusual, right? Because it's hard to run a minority government for a long time. So if you think about Mr. Harper, he wins in 2006, has another election in 2008, has an election in 2011. If you think about those Pearson years, there's an election in 62, 63, 65, 66, 68, right? So it's not uncommon because inevitably these minority governments run up against obstacles in Parliament and they've got to go at some point, so they're going to go when it's favorable. So Mr. Trudeau's not outside of the historical norm. He's not being unreasonable wanting to have an election, within 2 years of when he had his last one. Voters will still ask the question, some of them will at least, about whether it's necessary.
No, I don't want it.
You don't want the election?
No.
Yeah, there's no issue with an election right now. I don't see why not. We got to get back to normal life here.
It's bad timing because of the way with COVID and everything. It's probably bad timing. So I don't think it's a good idea and costs more money.
Yeah, it seems soon to me. I wouldn't be necessarily looking for that right now.
I mean, it just seems like unfortunate timing. Everybody has so much going on and is dealing with so many things in the world right now. I think the last thing we need is an election.
It's easy to forget that David Peterson was the most popular politician in Canada in 1990, and he called an election, and the bottom just sort of fell out. We've got an amazing kind of political system in Canada, in that in U.S. elections, a 4 or 5 point swing between the parties is huge. In Canada, we have cases where parties will go up 10, 15 points over the course of an election. Mr. Trudeau started the 2015 campaign in 3rd place. That campaign had 3 different front runners in it at different points in time. The NDP looked like they were going to win that campaign, and they finished in a distant third. So we have these incredibly dynamic elections. So the risk is always that you call the election at the wrong time, you get a couple of bad breaks, and suddenly the bottom falls out.
Trudeau's recent polling numbers are too good to pass up, says pollster Greg Lyle, especially in Ontario.
It's a big deal. There's 124 seats in Ontario, right? So basically 1 in 5 of the Ontario seats are seats that Harper won and that the Tories have been nowhere near in the last 2 elections. It's hard to imagine the Tories winning government without flipping those seats back. And they're mostly suburban, very much GTA, few Ottawa suburbs, one of the Hamilton suburbs. There's also a group of swing seats, 30 swing seats in Ontario that have consistently moved back and forth between the Tories and the Liberals. In the last election, the Liberals won 23 of those seats. The Tories only won 7. And those numbers are not any better for the Tories in the last election. But the fact that the Liberals may be able to steal seats that were won by 10% or more by the Tories in the last election bodes really well for the Liberals.
Do you know who this is? Probably not.
Aaron O'Toole has to get known. This is his chance to introduce himself to the public. People really don't know a lot about him, which was kind of a similar tune to Andrew Scheer. And the danger there is that you allow the Liberals and other parties to define you before you can define yourself. His numbers also are low on kind of engagement. He needs to kind of be a bit more vibrant and show people, that a bit more of his personality, I would say.
I mean, Aaron O'Toole didn't use his power as an opposition leader to improve benefits or to extend benefits or to strengthen the Climate Change Act. And if Jagmeet Singh can use his profile to get that message through that New Democrats made a difference, and he's the face of the New Democrats, I think that could make a real difference for him.
What does Aaron O'Toole have to do to get this right in his first federal election campaign?
2 things. He has to run a really strong national campaign so that the local constituents can see a national leader, but the local candidates have to run a really solid campaign as well. A lot of the people who are running for re-election are going to be able to rely upon what they've done for their community and how much they're loved by their community, and that will work out. So they need to keep their local base as the most important thing for them. What the leader has to do is show that he can lead and that the party is ready to lead and the party has vision and an understanding of the issues. And that's where the national campaign comes in, and campaigns do matter.
As for the New Democrats, Jagmeet Singh's popularity has been on the rise, and it may be reflected at the polls.
I think he'll do well, and I say that because in the last campaign he was new, he was still introducing himself to Canadians, and frankly the party finances were not in great shape. He was a new leader, newly elected in the House, and he was really introducing himself to Canadians. And he surprised people. People liked him. He did well in difficult circumstances. So this time, the NDP is better funded. I think they're going to be better prepared. He's much more seasoned as a leader. So I think he'll improve the party fortunes considerably.
In the riding of Thornhill, north of Toronto, both the Conservative and the Liberal candidate have hit the ground running.
As the candidate from 2019, I've been ready to go from day one. And now that the Honourable Peter Kent isn't running, of course, it opens up the riding tremendously. And people have been saying, Gary, we need you, we need your support, we need your help.
But Gary Gladstone is in for a tough ride. He lost in 2019 by some 11,000 votes. Thornhill is considered one of the safest Conservative ridings in the 905 Greater Toronto area. Peter Kent held it for 15 years and is retiring. Melissa Lanceman is hoping to take over.
I was born and raised here. I actually grew up a stone's throw away from where we're standing in my first ever campaign office, and hopefully not my last. I went to school here. I got my first job here. My parents immigrated to this country and chose Thornhill, so I was lucky enough to have the birthright here.
I've lived in Thornhill for 25 years, raised my family here, very active in the community, and it's time. Thornhill needs a voice in government, and Thornhill needs, the community needs appropriate representation.
Less plastic is one way Gladstone is hoping to distinguish himself from his opponent. He's vowed not to use unrecyclable election signs.
In the last campaign, was unable to find lawn signs that could easily be recycled, so I only had the large signs. I didn't have the lawn signs. This time around, I've been able to find signs that are easily recyclable, so I will. But the environment is key for my children, grandchildren, to ensure that the planet is in a good place.
Landsman says she's focusing on affordability in her riding.
You will hear that it's impossible for somebody to live where their parents raised them. This community is no different. The housing prices are out of control. We've got really, really big problems on affordability and on making sure that the next generation can do what their parents did.
The riding of Milton, also in the 905, was considered blue and bulletproof in 2019, but Lisa Raitt lost to Liberal Adam Van Couverden by more than 8,000 votes.
What was that loss like for you?
I knew I was going to lose. I felt it at the door. I knew that, remember I said at the beginning, you need a national campaign and you need a local campaign. And what I heard at the doors was we love you, Lisa. We're really grateful that you're our representative, but you know, we can't vote nationally for you. And that's what ended up happening. And it was decisive. It was not a squeaker at all. It was people just decided they just did not see themselves voting for a national Conservative Party, regardless of what my profile was or how I did in the community.
Upsets happen in politics. There are several Ontario ridings that are sure to be interesting.
We have a base in Hamilton that obviously we're going to not just want to hold but expand. So we'll be watching that. My good friend Tracy Ramsey in Windsor, Essex, lost her seat in the last election, and I'm really hoping that she's going to be re-elected this time. Yes, I'm going to be watching the Windsor area seats. London as well. Going to be looking there. And Brampton, you know, Jagmeet Singh is from Brampton. We now have, the NDP has MPPs elected in Brampton. And
they really struggled during this pandemic.
And, you know, if there was ever a case for needing New Democrat representatives to fight for people who are getting a raw deal, it's the community in Brampton. So I would really hope that we can pick up seats in the Brampton area because, frankly, the Liberals did not deliver for people in Brampton.
I'll be watching the GTA, the 905, the suburbs outside of Toronto that tend to swing in a block and elect the government. The Liberals did very well in those ridings in the last election. They even took a seat in Milton from Lisa Raitt. And so a lot of those ridings are actually held by Conservatives provincially and the Liberals federally, so it will be interesting to see if any of those turn towards the Conservatives. And then some of the southern ridings too, Windsor, that's going to be a battle between the NDP and the Liberals. So I'm watching for, you know, kind of the outside Toronto ridings and some of those kind of working class ridings where I think, you know, the Conservatives will also be trying to make some headway as well.
I'm going to watch ridings where Conservative incumbents are not running again.
Like Thornhill.
Like Thornhill, I think we're okay in Thornhill. I think Melissa Landsman is out on the ground. She's doing a lot of work on it, and it is a conservative-ish kind of riding. I don't know if it's a Peter Kent riding or it's a Conservative riding, but we're going to find out, aren't we? I would look at David Sweet's riding, Hamilton Ancaster. I would look at Phil McColman's riding, Brantford Brant. All of these places are areas where that 416 contingent, which has been Liberal NDP forever, have moved during the pandemic. So they're living in Niagara, they're living in Ancaster, they're living in Brantford. And let's see what that happens in terms of the traditional Conservative vote.
think about ridings like Durham, the leader of the opposition's riding. I think that's one that it's certainly up for grabs from the Liberals that they just didn't pick up in 2019, but and were close to in 2015. So the recent polling seems to indicate a strong opportunity for the Liberals to capitalize on those seats right now. And so I suspect that those sort of key ridings in the eastern band of the GTA, probably some ridings in Niagara, St. Catharines, Hamilton, some ridings that are held by the New Democrats in Windsor and London. Those are all sort of in play for the Liberals given the strength in the polling position right now.
According to Nanos research, out of the 17 million votes that were cast in the 2019 election, the Liberals were just 21,000 votes short in 13 ridings of winning a majority. We'll see what happens in 2021. From Burlington, Ontario, I'm Laura Di Battista for CPAC.